Okay, so here we are, final video for class, and in this one we're going to talk more specifically about the Odyssey itself, the epic. So in the last video we talked about the return stories of Menelaus and Agamemnon, and I've set you up a little bit to understand the dual timelines and the dual scenes of the Odyssey. So we've got, what's going on with Odysseus in the 20 years that he's gone versus what's going on in Ithaca with his family, his wife Penelope, his son Telemachus, his parents, and then the men who are living in his home, essentially trying to force Penelope to marry one of them and essentially make one of them the king of Ithaca. So now I want to shift gears and talk a little bit about the structure of the narrative and to introduce another important term for understanding how this epic is told, which is called a frame narrative. So the story of the Odyssey, right, begins around the time that he leaves Calypso's island and Telemachus decides to leave Ithaca to try to find him. So that's when our story picks up. So you might remember from our discussion of the Iliad that this is called beginning in medias res, right? We're beginning in the middle of the action. We've already had a long backstory of what's been going on in Ithaca. And we already know that Odysseus has been stuck on this island for 7 years. So the action is already moving. It's when things become even more strained in Ithaca that we have that kind of inciting incident, this catalyst, to get the story started. So let's remember in medias res. The other thing, or the newer term that I want you to learn is called frame narrative. And you may have already heard this before, but a frame narrative is an embedded story or a story within a story that's often told by the protagonist. So at some point in the Odyssey, Odysseus is going to get the chance to tell the story of his wanderings at sea and his time with Calypso as a flashback during the main narrative, right? And so this is important not only because it helps to fill in the gaps of what he's been doing for these 10 years while his family has been waiting for him to return. But it also allows us to think of Odysseus himself as a storyteller, right? As someone who manipulates information and who can present information in a way that's valuable to himself and reflects well on himself. So you'll always have to remember as you're reading all of the stories about Odysseus from the Trojan War. Remember, he considered himself a master strategist. He comes up with the idea of the Trojan horse. He recruits all of these men when he's given these new conditions for victory. In a lot of ways, he makes the Trojan War happen for the Greeks, right? Where we've seen that Agamemnon's leadership style can be strained at times. Odysseus is ultimately the one who manages to get things done. So Odysseus as storyteller is another important facet of his characterization. The way that he presents himself to others is going to be an ongoing theme in the epic itself. All right, so we've got the frame narrative. We know that we're beginning in medias res. So let's take a look at how the Odyssey is actually structured. So remember, we're balancing two settings, right? Odysseus kind of having his adventures and Ithaca and what's happening on the home front. So the first 4 books of the Odyssey completely take place in Ithaca. And this is our introduction to Telemachus, Penelope, and the situation in Ithaca with all of these men living in their home. Telemachus becoming more frustrated that they don't have any news of Odysseus, and also worried that he and his mother are in danger because the suitors won't leave. And since his mom won't make a decision, Telemachus, as a young man who's starting to understand that this is rapidly becoming his responsibility, decides that he's going to head out to try to figure out what happened to his dad. And what he does is visit some of his father's veteran friends, Menelaus and Nestor, to try to see if they have any news of what might have happened to him. The first 4 books are sometimes called the Telemachy because they are so much about Odysseus' son, and it really helps us to understand who he is and why he feels threatened. The next 4 books, books 5 through 8, narrate what happened to Odysseus as he is leaving Calypso's island. So if we imagine Telemachus and Odysseus starting off at the same point, Odysseus has been on this island for 7 years, and he's decided it's time for him to leave and to try to make his way home. But along the way, he's shipwrecked, and he washes up on an island called Scheria. And on Scheria, the people are called the Phaeacians. And the Phaeacians take Odysseus in. They find him on the shore. They take him in. They wash him up. They give him lots of food. They make him very comfortable. And then they ask him to tell them who he is and what his story is. And so this is where we get our frame narrative. So books 9 through 12 are first-person narrations where Odysseus is telling the story of all of his wanderings. So what happened in those 3 years before he wound up on Calypso's island and stayed with her for 7. And these are adventures that are filled with monsters and witches and sea monsters and land monsters and people who do drugs and magic. I mean, it's fantastical in the sense that it would belong in something like a fantasy novel. But incredibly important in stories that tell us a little bit more about Odysseus and who he is. The second half of the book, books 13 through 24, combine the 2 storylines. So Odysseus makes his way back to Ithaca, and then Telemachus himself returns to Ithaca. The family, or we'll say at least Odysseus and Telemachus, reunite, and then they need to find a way to deal with this strange situation at home, where Odysseus is now aware of the fact that all of these men are living in his home and trying to marry his wife and disinherit his son. So he's kind of walking a fine line where he needs to find a resolution, but he also has to do it in a way that is cautious and safe so that he doesn't compel the suitors to murder his son or do something violent once they realize that Odysseus is home. So that's actually all I'm going to say about it, because those 12 books are incredibly rich. There's a lot that happens, and there's a lot that we'll have to delve into that relate to themes of coming home after being gone for so long. So remember, unlike Agamemnon, who made it home pretty directly from Troy, but was killed right away when he returned, Odysseus has had 10 additional years before he gets home. So a lot has happened. His children, or his child is much older than Agamemnon's children were when he returned. And his son is a man. His son isn't a boy. And Odysseus himself has changed. Like he has seen and done many more things than the other Greek warriors did, right? The ones who just came straight home. So the story of how he reintegrates and tries to once again become a member of his community in Ithaca is almost as important as what happens while he's gone for those 10 years. And a good amount of time is also given to his wife and his son, the people on the home front who are trying to figure out how they're supposed to live their lives, but also run this city when the king is gone. How do they do this mindfully, and how do they do this fairly? And how do they manage this community when they themselves are not actually the ruler, but they're holding his place? So there's a lot that we'll get to discuss. It's a very rich story. So we'll leave off here. For Tuesday, when we meet again, I'd like for you to read the first 4 books of the Odyssey. So this is the Telemachy, the story of Telemachus, and what he gets up to during his time. And that's what we'll start with on Tuesday, is diving into the situation on Ithaca. All right, I hope you have a wonderful rest of your week, and I will see you all on Tuesday.